Chapter 4. The Enigma, the Origin of Eastern Europe's Jews. Arthur Koestler was a Zionist pioneer in his youth, even a close supporter of the Zionist right-wing leader Vladimir Jabotinsky, but grew disillusioned with the settlement project and the Jewish national movement. Later he was a communist, but grew to detest Stalin and became bitterly anti-Soviet. Nevertheless, he continued to support the existence of the State of Israel, and was concerned about the Jewish refugees who flocked to it. Throughout his life, he opposed all forms of racism in general, and anti-Semitism in particular, and fought against them with his considerable literary talent. Most of his books were translated into Hebrew, and were quite successful. One of the impulses that prompted him to write The 13th Tribe was his determination to defeat, while he still could, Hitler's heritage in the world. He wrote, "The large majority of surviving Jews in the world is of Eastern European, and thus perhaps mainly of Khazar, origin. If so, this would mean that their ancestors came not from the Jordan but from the Volga, not from Canaan but from the Caucasus, once believed to be the cradle of the Aryan race, and that genetically they are more closely related to the Hun, Uyghur and Magyar tribes than to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Should this turn out to be the case, then the term antisemitism would become void of meaning, based on a misapprehension shared by both the killers and their victims. The story of the Khazar Empire, as it slowly emerges from the past, begins to look like the most cruel hoax which history has ever perpetrated." Koestler was not certain, in the 1970s, whether the non-Ashkenazi Jews were descendants of the Judeans, and if the Khazar conversion was an exception in Jewish history. Nor did he understand that his battle against anti-Semitic racism might deal a mortal blow to Zionism's principal imaginary. Or rather, he did and did not understand, and naively assumed that if he declared an unambiguous political position at the end of the book, he would be exonerated. I am aware of the danger that it may be maliciously misinterpreted as a denial of the State of Israel's right to exist. But that right is not based on the hypothetical origins of the Jewish people, nor on the mythological covenant of Abraham with God. It is based on international law, i.e., on the United Nations decision in 1947. Whatever the Israeli citizens' racial origins, and whatever illusions they entertain about them, their state exists de jure and de facto, and cannot be undone, except by genocide. But it was no use. In the 1970s Israel was caught up in the momentum of territorial expansion, and without the Old Testament in its hand, and the exile of the Jewish people in its memory, it would have had no justification for annexing Arab Jerusalem and establishing settlements in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and even the Sinai Peninsula. The writer who was able, in his classic novel Darkness at Noon, to crack the communist enigma, did not comprehend that the Zionist enigma was entirely caught up in the mythology of an eternal ethnic time. Nor did he foresee that the post-1967 Zionists would resemble the Stalinists in their ferocious response. Both saw him as an irredeemable traitor. When the book appeared, Israel's ambassador to Britain described it as an anti-Semitic action financed by the Palestinians. The organ of the World Zionist Organization, in the diasporas of the exile, suggested that perhaps this cosmopolitan has begun, after all, to wonder about his own roots, but that most probably Koestler feared he was a forgotten writer, and sensed that a Jewish theme, presented from a paradoxical and unusual perspective, and done skillfully, would restore public interest in him. The Zionist publication expressed a deep concern that thanks to its exotic elements and Koestler's prestige, the book would appeal to Jewish readers without either historical understanding or a critical faculty, who might accept its thesis and implications literally. Professor Tzavion Khoury, of the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University, among other institutions, compared Koestler to Jacob Vollmarayer, the German scholar who already in the 19th century had suggested that the modern Greeks were not descendants of the ancient Hellenes, as they imagined, but of a hodgepodge of Slavs, Bulgars, Albanians and others who had poured into the Peloponnese and gradually mixed with its original population. We might speculate, Onkori wrote, about Kustler's psychological reasons for borrowing from Abraham Pollock's old thesis, which had been dismissed in the past and could harm Israel in the present. Later Professor Shlomo Simonson, Onkori's respected colleague at Tel Aviv University, also wondered if the reasons for Kustler's writing about the Jewish Khazars might have to do with his conflicted identity as an Eastern European immigrant within British culture. It is not surprising at all, added this senior Israeli historian, that a recently published work on the history of Jewish self-hate devoted a substantial section to Kostler. Simonson, like Onkori, noted that the source of this discredited story about the origin of Eastern European Jews was the work of their Tel Aviv colleague Professor Pollock. But neither Pollock, a professional historian, nor Kostler, who did not claim to be one, invented the thesis that a large part of Eastern European Jewry originated in the territories of the Khazar Empire. It should be stressed that this hypothesis, reviled since the 1970s as scandalous, disgraceful and anti-Semitic, had previously been accepted in various scholarly circles, both Zionist and non-Zionist, although it never became the consensus, because of the fears it aroused among the ethnocentric. Already in 1867, for example, the great Jewish scholar Abraham Harkivy had written in the introduction to his book The Jews and the Languages of the Slavs that the first Jews who came to the southern regions from Russia did not originate in Germany, as many writers tend to believe, but from the Greek cities on the shores of the Black Sea and from Asia, via the mountains of the Caucasus. Harkivy stated that later waves of immigration brought Jews also from Germany, and since they were more numerous, the Yiddish language eventually became dominant among the Jews of Eastern Europe, but in the 17th century they still spoke Slavic. Zubnev, too, before he became a well-known and responsible historian, wondered in an early letter, whence did the first Jews who came to Poland and Russia originate, in the Western countries, or the lands of the Khazars and Crimea? He assumed that the answer would be found only as archaeology progressed, furnishing the historical narrative with further evidence. Yitzhak Schipper, a senior socio-economic historian and a prominent Zionist in Poland, believed for a long time that the Khazar thesis accounted well for the massive demographic presence of Jews in Eastern Europe. In this, he was following a series of Polish scholars, Jewish and non-Jewish, who had written about the first settlements of Jewish believers in Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. Schipper also assumed that there had been authentic Jews in Judaizing Khazaria who contributed to the development of crafts and commerce in the powerful empire that stretched from the Volga to the Dnieper River. But he was also convinced that the influence of Judaism on the Khazars and the Eastern Slavs gave rise to the large Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. We have seen that Salah Baron followed Pollock and devoted a good many pages to the Khazar issue. Despite the built-in ethnicism of his work, he made an unusual digression from linear history when he stopped at the Khazar way station. Unable to overlook the views of most Polish historians between the world wars, let alone the comprehensive work of the Israeli historian Pollock, Baron wrote. But before and after the Mongol upheaval the Khazars sent many offshoots into the unsubdued Slavonic lands, helping ultimately to build up the great Jewish centers of Eastern Europe. During the half-millennium, 740 to 1250, of its existence, however, and its aftermath in the Eastern European communities, this noteworthy experiment in Jewish statecraft doubtless exerted a greater influence on Jewish history than we are as yet able to envisage. From Khazaria Jews began drifting into the open steppes of Eastern Europe, during both the period of their country's affluence and that of its decline. After Sviatoslav's victories and the ensuing decline of the Khazar Empire, on the other hand, refugees from the devastated districts, including Jews, sought shelter in the very lands of their conquerors. Here they met other Jewish groups and individuals migrating from the west and south. Together with these arrivals from Germany and the Balkans, they began laying the foundations for a Jewish community which, especially in 16th-century Poland, outstripped all the other contemporary areas of Jewish settlement in population density as well as in economic and cultural power. Baron was not a self-hating Jew and certainly not hostile to the Zionist enterprise, and neither was his Jerusalem colleague Benzion Dino. Nevertheless, the latter, Israel's Minister of Education in the 1950s, did not hesitate to join Baron and Pollock and express an unambiguous position regarding the origins of the Eastern European Jews. The Russian conquests did not destroy the Khazar kingdom entirely, but they broke it up and diminished it. And this kingdom, which had absorbed Jewish immigrants and refugees from many exiles, must itself have become a diaspora mother, the mother of one of the greatest of the diasporas, of Israel in Russia, Lithuania, and Poland. Readers today might be astonished to hear that Israel's high priest of memory in the 1950s did not hesitate to describe Khazars as the diaspora mother of Eastern European Jewry. It goes without saying that here, too, his rhetoric was suffused with characteristic ethno-biological thinking. Dino, like Baron, needed the historical connection with the born Jews who were in Khazars before it was Judaized. Nevertheless, the fact is that until the 1960s the assumption that the majority of the Yiddish people did not originate in Germany but in the Caucasus, the Volga steppes, the Black Sea and the Slav countries was an acceptable assumption, caused no shock, and was not considered anti-Semitic, as it was after the early 1970s. The statement by the Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce that any history is first of all a product of the time of its writing has long been a commonplace, but it still fits perfectly the Zionist historiography of the Jewish past. The conquest of the city of David in 1967 had to be achieved by the direct descendants of the House of David, not, perish the thought, by the offspring of tough horsemen from the Volga-Don steppes, the deserts of southern Arabia, or the coast of North Africa. In other words, the whole, undivided land of Israel needed more than ever a whole, undivided people of Israel. Traditional Zionist historiography had always maintained that the Jews of Eastern Europe had come from Germany. Before that, they had spent some time in Rome, to which they had been driven from the land of Israel. The essentialist view of the exiled, wandering people, combined with the prestige of a civilized country such as Germany, overshadowed the lowly status of Europe's backward regions and created a winning product, just as the Jews from the Arab countries tend to describe themselves as Sephardic. So the Jews of Eastern Europe prefer to see themselves as Ashkenazi. Although there is no historical evidence showing that Jews migrated from Western Germany to the continent's east, the fact that Jews in Poland, Lithuania and Russia spoke Yiddish supposedly proved that the Eastern European Jews were originally German Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. As the vocabulary of the language spoken by these Jews was 80% Germanic, how did it happen that Khazars and all sorts of Slavs, who had previously spoken Turkic or Slavonic dialects, ended up speaking Yiddish? Isaac Bear Levinson, also known as Rival, described as the father of Jewish enlightenment in Russia, stated in his book Testimony in Israel, published in 1828. Our elders told us that some generations earlier the Jews in these parts spoke only this Russian language, and this Ashkenazi Jewish language we speak now had not yet spread among all the Jews living in these regions. Harkivy, too, was convinced that before the 17th century most Eastern European Jews spoke Slavic dialects. Pollock, who gave much thought to this issue, proposed several hypotheses, some more persuasive than others. A less than convincing suggestion was that a large part of the Judaized Khazar population, especially those who lived in the Crimea, were still speaking an ancient Gothic language that had been common in the peninsula till the 16th century, and resembled Yiddish much more than the German that was current at that time in the German lands. A more plausible suggestion was that the Germanic colonization that spread eastward in the 14th and 15th centuries, bringing with it large German-speaking commercial and artisanal populations, led to the spreading of their language among those who acted as mediators between these economic powerhouses and the local nobility and peasantry, which continued to speak their Slavic dialects. Some 4 million Germans had migrated from Eastern Germany into Poland, where they created Eastern Europe's first bourgeoisie, and also brought the Roman Catholic clergy with them. The Jews, who came mainly from the east and the south, not only from the Khazar lands, but also from the Slavic regions under its influence, took on certain functions in the division of labor that formed with the first signs of modernization. Becoming tax collectors and prosperous minters of coins, silver coins bearing Polish words in Hebrew characters have been found, as well as humble carters, woodworkers and furriers. The Jews filled intermediate positions in production and mingled with the cultures and languages of the different classes. They might also have brought some of these skills from the Khazar Empire. Kostler described this historical scene in vivid terms. One can visualize a shtetl craftsman, a cobbler perhaps, or a timber merchant, speaking broken German to his clients, broken Polish to the serfs on the estate next door, and at home mixing the most expressive bits of both with Hebrew into a kind of intimate private language. How this hodgepodge became communalized and standardized to the extent to which it did, is any linguist's guess. Later, a limited immigration of Jewish elites from Germany, rabbis and Talmudic scholars, young and old, completed the process, further establishing the new language of the masses and apparently also modifying and consolidating their rituals. These religious elites, seemingly invited in from the West, enjoyed a prestige that many wanted to emulate and share, hence the expansion and consolidation of the German vocabulary. Yet such a pivotal word as to pray, a key concept in the ritual imaginary, was retained in its Turkish dialect form, davening. Like many other words in Yiddish, it did not come from a German dialect. Although the immigrants from the West contributed significantly to it, Yiddish did not resemble the German Jewish dialect that developed in the ghettos of Western Germany. There the Jewish population was concentrated in the Rhine region, and its dialect incorporated many words and expressions from the local French and German dialects, of which there is not a trace in Eastern Yiddish. Already in 1924 the philologist Matthias Mises had argued that Yiddish could never have come from Western Germany, although in that period the concentrations of Jews were in fact to be found there, not in the eastern part of the territory of German dialect speakers. More recently, the Tel Aviv linguist Paul Wexler published some thorough studies supporting the assumption that the spread of Yiddish was not due to migration of Jews from the West. Its basis is Slavic, and its vocabulary is predominantly southeastern German. In its origins, Yiddish resembles the Sorb language, which evolved in the boundary regions between speakers of Slavic and Germanic dialects. Like Yiddish, it almost disappeared in the 20th century. Demographically, too, the thesis that the Jews of Eastern Europe originated in Western Germany is challenged by an inconvenient fact. The number of Jewish believers in the 11th to 13th centuries in the territory between Mainz and Worms, Cologne and Strasbourg, was very small. There are no precise data, but estimates range from a few hundred to a few thousand, never more. It is possible that some wandered eastward during the Crusades, though there is no evidence to suggest this, and moreover it is known that the fugitives from the pogroms did not go far and usually returned to their homes, but in any case, such a trickle could not have given rise to the huge Jewish communities of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. If these communities originated in Western Germany, as Israel's establishment historians argue today, why did they multiply so dramatically in the East while remaining demographically stable in the West, long before the use of birth control? Surely the quantities of food and sanitary conditions in Eastern Europe were hardly superior to depleted, hungry and unhygienic Western Europe. In the final analysis, life in the poverty-stricken small towns in the East was no more conducive to propagation than life in the cities of Britain, France, and Germany, yet it was in the East that the demographic Big Bang took place, with the result that speakers of Yiddish dialects constituted, on the eve of the 20th century, 80% of all the Jews in the world. Khazaria collapsed some time before the first indications of the presence of Jews in Eastern Europe, and it is difficult not to connect the two. Although Jewish believers in Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania and Hungary erased their Khazar or Slavic past from memory, and remembered instead, like the descendants of Himyars and North Africa's Judaizers, how they came out of Egypt's house of bondage, various vestiges of their true historical past did remain. In their migration westward, they left a few markers by the side of the road. Back in the 1920s, Yitzhak Schipper discovered in the regions of the Ukraine, Transylvania, Istria, Poland and Lithuania a number of place names that contain some form of the terms Khazar or Kagan. There are also given and family names that hark back to the Khazar or Slavic East, rather than the Germanic West. Names for animals such as the hawk, bolabon, deer, wolf and bear were not known in the kingdoms of Judea or Himyars, or among the Jews of Spain and North Africa, and they reached Western Europe quite late. Aside from these rather minor indications, there are some sociological and anthropological elements uniquely associated with Eastern Jewry that cannot be found anywhere in the West. The essential way of life of the typical Yiddish townlet, which must also have preserved the dialect, has never been found in the Rhine area or its vicinity. From the 2nd century BCE, when Judaism began to spread in the world, it flourished in small faith communities mostly on the margins of cities and towns, and only rarely in villages. In Western and Southern Europe, Jews never created separate settlements. But the Jewish townlet, not always small, and not always exclusively Jewish, permitted its inhabitants to differ from its neighbors not only in religious practices and norms but also in more secular ways, such as language or the architectural style of prayer houses. At the center of the Jewish townlet stood the synagogue, with a double dome reminiscent of the Eastern pagoda. Jewish dress in Eastern Europe did not resemble that of the Jews of France or Germany. The yarmulke, also derived from a Turkic word, and the fur hat worn over it were more reminiscent of the people of the Caucasus and the horsemen of the steppes than of Talmudic scholars from Mainz or merchants from Worms. These garments, like the long silk kaftan worn chiefly on the Sabbath, differed from the clothing worn by the Belarusian or Ukrainian peasants. But any mention of these features and others, from food to humor, from clothing to chants, all connected to the specific cultural morphology of their daily life and their history, scarcely interested the scholars who were occupied in inventing the eternal history of the people of Israel. They could not come to terms with the troublesome fact that there had never been a Jewish people's culture, but only a popular Yiddish culture that resembled the cultures of their neighbors much more than it did those of the Jewish communities of Western Europe or North Africa. Today the descendants of the Jews of Yiddishland live mainly in the United States and Israel. The remains of millions of others are buried beneath the slaughterhouses constructed by Hitler in the 20th century when we consider the tremendous effort that the memory agents in Israel have invested in commemorating their dying moments, compared with the scanty effort made to discover the rich or wretched, depending on one's viewpoint, life lived in Yiddishland before the vicious massacre. We can draw only sad conclusions about the political and ideological role of modern historiography. Like the absence of costly archaeological exploration in southern Russia, and the Ukraine to uncover the remains of Khazars, the absence of sociological, linguistic and ethnographic studies about the long-standing ways of life in the townlets of Poland and Lithuania, work of innovative historical research, not mere folklore, is no accident. No one wants to go looking under stones when venomous scorpions might be lurking beneath them, waiting to attack the self-image of the existing ethnos and its territorial ambitions. The writing of national history is not seriously meant to uncover past civilizations. Its principal aim thus far has been the construction of a meta-identity, and the political consolidation of the present. History deals with books, not with things, a patriotic scholar might argue, having spent his or her entire life interpreting religious, governmental and ideological texts produced in the past by a paper-thin elite. This is true where the traditional study of the past is concerned. But the advent of anthropological history began, slowly but surely, to corrode the simplistic Zionist metahistories. Sometimes it seems that most of the scholars who have specialized in the history of the people of Israel have yet to hear about this strange new form of historiography. A deeper exploration of the ways of life and communication in past Jewish communities might further expose a wicked little fact, that the further we move from religious norms and the more we focus our research on diverse daily practices, the more we discover that there never was a secular ethnographic common denominator between the Jewish believers in Asia, Africa, and Europe. world Jewry had always been a major religious culture. Though consisting of various elements, it was not a strange, wandering nation. There is a good deal of irony in the fact that people who adopted the religion of Moses had been living between the Volga and the Don rivers before the arrival there of Russians and Ukrainians, just as Judaizers had been living in Gaul before it was invaded by Frankish tribes. So, too, in North Africa, where Punics converted to Judaism before the arrival of the Arabs, and in the Iberian Peninsula, where a Judaic culture flourished and struck root before the Christian Reconquista. In contrast to the image of the past that Christian Judeophobes began to promote, and that modern anti-Semites echoed, there had never been in all history a cursed nation race that was driven out of the Holy Land for killing the divine Messiah, and that settled uninvited among other nations. The offspring of the Judaizers around the Mediterranean, in Odia Bene before and after the Common Era, the descendants of the Himyars, the Berbers and the Khazars, were linked by the Jewish monotheism that bridged the diverse linguistic cultural groups that arose in far-flung lands and followed different historical paths. Many abandoned Judaism, others clung to it stubbornly and succeeded in carrying it to the threshold of the secular age. Is Himyar, Berber and Khazar time lost beyond recovery? Is there no chance that a new historiography would invite those ancient Jews, who have been forgotten by their descendants, to reappear in the legitimate sphere of public memory? The construction of a new body of knowledge always bears a direct connection with the national ideology in which it operates. Historical insights that diverge from the narrative laid down at the inception of the nation can be accepted only when consternation about their implications is abated. This can happen when the current collective identity begins to be taken for granted and ceases to be something that anxiously and nostalgically clings to a mythical past, when identity becomes the basis for living and not its purpose, that is when historiographic change can take place. For now, it is difficult to predict whether the Israeli politics of identity will permit, in the early 21st century, the emergence of fresh paradigms for the investigation of the origins and history of Jewish faith communities.